I didn't ruin my life with a single bad decision. I ruined it with patience. With waiting. With planning. With the quiet belief that there would always be more time. I was never reckless. That's important to understand. I didn't burn bridges. I didn't chase chaos. I didn't make dramatic mistakes that could explain everything later. I was careful. Careful enough to postpone myself indefinitely. Whenever something felt important, but inconvenient, I told myself, later. When something stirred inside me, a desire, an idea, a pull toward a different life, I didn't reject it. I respected it politely, then placed it on an imaginary shelf marked when things settle. Things never settled. They just kept replacing each other. There was always a reason not to act yet. Responsibilities that needed handling. Stability that couldn't be risked. People who depended on me. Plans that required consistency. I told myself I was being responsible. What I was really doing was delaying discomfort. And delay is seductive. It feels harmless. Temporary. Reversible. I believed that life was something you prepare for and that the real part would begin once I had everything in order. I didn't notice how often I said no to myself without even hearing the question. The years passed quietly. That's what frightens me the most now. There was no alarm, no warning signal, no dramatic sense of loss. Just a gradual narrowing of possibility. I became very good at maintenance. Keeping things running. Keeping myself composed. Keeping expectations met. From the outside, my life looked sensible, even enviable. From the inside, it felt like a waiting room. I was always about to begin something. About to change. About to move, to start, to choose differently. Just not yet. Whenever I felt restless, I told myself it was normal. Everyone feels like this sometimes. Wanting more didn't mean I should disrupt what I had. It meant I should be grateful for what I already had. Gratitude became another postponement tool. I learned to be thankful instead of honest. I remember moments, flashes when the truth almost broke through. Standing somewhere unfamiliar and feeling briefly alive. Hearing someone talk about a choice they made impulsively and feeling a sharp envy I immediately buried. Imagining an alternative version of myself and quickly dismissing it as unrealistic. Those moments were warnings. I treated them like distractions. I told myself that time was on my side. That there was no rush. That I could always decide later, when I was more prepared, more confident, more certain. Certainty never arrived. Only habits did. I built a life that functioned efficiently. Predictably. Safely. And with every year, the cost of changing it increased. Options that once felt open slowly closed without ceremony. Not slammed shut. Just quietly removed from consideration. One day, I realized I had stopped imagining the future entirely. Not out of despair, out of routine. Tomorrow looked exactly like today, and that felt manageable. That should have terrified me. Instead, I adapted. I told myself that excitement is overrated. That adulthood is about endurance. That fulfillment is something you look back on, not something you feel every day. Those beliefs helped me sleep. They also kept me still. The moment that changed everything didn't look important at the time. Someone asked me a simple question, the kind people ask casually, without meaning to open anything deep. If you could do anything differently, what would it be? I smiled. I laughed softly. I gave a vague answer that sounded wise and non-committal. Later that night, alone, the question returned. And I realized I didn't have an answer because I had postponed all my real ones. I had lived as if time were an endless resource instead of a current that keeps moving whether you step into it or not. For the first time, I felt a specific fear. Not fear of failure. Not fear of loss. Fear of having waited my entire life for the moment when I would finally start living and realizing I might have already passed it. That thought didn't cause panic. It caused grief. A quiet grief for all the versions of me that never got a chance because I kept asking them to wait. I didn't change anything that night. But something shifted. I could no longer pretend that later was neutral. Later had become a decision. And it was one I had been making for years. After that night, the word later stopped feeling harmless. It followed me everywhere. Not loudly, persistently. Every time I postponed a choice, every time I delayed a decision that mattered to me, I could feel its weight. It wasn't neutral anymore. It was active. I started noticing patterns I had never questioned before. How often I chose the option that required the least emotional effort. How instinctively I avoided anything that might disrupt the life I had already built. How quickly I dismissed my own impulses as impractical, immature, or badly timed. I realized that postponement had become my primary coping mechanism. If something scared me, I delayed it. If something mattered too much, I delayed it. If something felt alive, uncertain, or risky, I delayed it the longest. Delay felt responsible. It felt controlled. It allowed me to believe I was still choosing, even when I wasn't. But time doesn't pause when you hesitate. It moves on without you. The more I became aware of that, the more suffocating my life felt. Not because it was bad, but because it was fixed. My routines were set. My responsibilities stable. My role clearly defined. There was no space left for experimentation. Any meaningful change now would require dismantling something. Hurting someone. Risking embarrassment. Admitting that I had been wrong to wait so long. That cost felt enormous. So I waited more. This is the cruel logic of postponement: the longer you delay, the more expensive action becomes. What once would have been a simple pivot turns into a rupture. What once felt possible begins to feel inappropriate. I started telling myself I had missed my window. Not dramatically, rationally. It wouldn't make sense now. I should have done this earlier. People my age don't start over. Those thoughts sounded mature. Realistic. Grounded. They were also a form of surrender. I noticed how I reacted to people who made late changes in their lives. Quiet judgment. Subtle disbelief. A reflexive urge to explain why it was different for them than it could ever be for me. When it hit me, I wasn't just postponing my own life. I was defending the idea that it was too late. Because if it was too late for everyone, then my waiting wasn't a mistake, it was fate. That belief kept me functional. It also kept me trapped. There were moments when the fear sharpened suddenly. Seeing an old photo. Hearing about someone's unexpected death. Realizing how quickly years had passed without anything truly new entering my life. Those moments didn't inspire action. They inspired panic, and panic made me cling harder to what I already knew. I began to feel like I was living in a shrinking room. The walls hadn't moved, but my sense of possibility had. Each year felt heavier than the last, not because it was harder but because it felt less reversible. I was haunted by the idea that if I tried now, I would only confirm my worst fear, that I had waited too long. So I stayed exactly where I was. Safe. Predictable. Unchanged. And deeply restless. The most painful realization was this: I wasn't afraid of failing if I tried. I was afraid of succeeding too late to matter. That fear paralyzed me completely. I told myself stories about timing. About seasons of life. About how some things are meant for certain ages, certain moments, certain versions of yourself, and once those pass, you should let them go gracefully. Grace became my excuse. But grief was building underneath it. I began to understand that postponement isn't passive. It's not the absence of action. It is a decision to preserve the present at the expense of the future. I had chosen preservation over growth for so long that growth now felt unnatural. Almost irresponsible. There were days when I considered making a change just to prove to myself that I still could. But even that impulse felt hollow. I didn't want change for its own sake. I wanted meaning. And meaning doesn't arrive on a schedule. The final shift came slowly, not as a dramatic insight but as a quiet conclusion. I realized that my life wasn't waiting for me anymore. It was moving on without my participation. The question was no longer when I would start living. It was whether I would accept that I might never start at all. That thought didn't make me cry. It made me still. Because for the first time, I understood the real cost of waiting. Not the opportunities one had missed. Not the paths I hadn't taken, but the version of myself I had trained to accept postponement as a way of life. And I didn't know how to undo that. The moment I finally stopped saying later, it wasn't because I felt ready. It was because later had run out of meaning. I woke up one morning with the strange sensation that time had moved ahead of me during the night. Nothing external had changed. The same walls. The same routine waiting patiently. But internally, something felt finished. Not broken. Finished. I realized I had reached a point where postponement no longer protected me. It only prolonged the damage. The life I had preserved so carefully was intact and completely detached from who I was. That realization didn't come with motivation. It came with mourning. I grieved the years I had treated like rehearsal. The risks I had postponed until they expired. The choices I had delayed until they quietly removed themselves from my life. I had always imagined regret as something loud. Dramatic. Full of obvious mistakes. What I felt instead was quieter. Regret for all the times nothing happened. I tried, finally, to act. Not impulsively. Not heroically. I made small moves, tentative, careful attempts to step outside the life I had been maintaining. I reached for things I had once postponed. Opportunities that still existed, but now required more courage than they used to. And that's when I learned the most painful lesson of all. Starting late has a different cost. The world doesn't pause for you while you prepare. When you wait too long, doors don't slam shut, they become heavier. The energy required to open them multiplies. You are no longer choosing freely, you are compensating for time lost. I could feel it in my body. The hesitation. The doubt. The constant comparison to who I might have been if I had started earlier. Every step forward was haunted by an invisible shadow of delay. I wasn't too late. But I wasn't on time either. That in-between space is brutal. I understood then why so many people never start at all. It's not laziness. It's grief. It's the fear that beginning late will only confirm how much you've lost. I had to decide whether that fear would finish what postponement had started. There were moments when I wanted to retreat back into waiting. It was familiar. Safe. Undemanding. Waiting doesn't ask you to confront your own history. Action does. But I also knew something else now. If I went back to waiting, I would never leave it again. So I kept going, not with confidence, but with honesty. I stopped pretending I could erase the past. I stopped trying to catch up. I let myself be a beginner in a life that should have started years earlier. That humility hurt. But it was real. I learned to accept that some things would always ache. That some paths were gone forever. That some versions of myself existed only as ghosts of timing. And I learned something unexpected. Even late beginnings carry weight. They are quieter. Less glamorous. Less forgiving, but they are still beginnings. And they still matter, not because they fix the past, but because they prevent the future from becoming another postponement. I don't live with urgency now. I live with awareness. I no longer tell myself there will always be time. I don't say later unless I mean never. I treat delay as the decision it truly is. Sometimes I still feel grief when I think about what could have been. That grief doesn't control me anymore. It reminds me why I can't wait again. Because here is the truth I learned too slowly, but not too late to speak it: you don't ruin your life by making the wrong choice once. You ruin it by delaying the right ones until they expire. Waiting feels safe because it postpones risk. But it also postpones living. I kept saying later because I thought time was patient. It isn't. It just keeps going. And the only thing it asks in return is whether you're willing to move with it imperfectly, belatedly, honestly, or whether you'll stand still until it leaves you behind completely. I don't know how much time I have left. None of us do. But I know this: I will never again confuse waiting with wisdom. Because a life postponed long enough doesn't end in disaster. It ends in silence. And silence is the one thing I am no longer willing to accept.